You are holding a bucket. This detail matters. The bucket is brass, dented along one side, and it is warm in a way that has nothing to do with the February morning outside. It is warm because of what is in it. You're not going to think about what is in it. You're going to walk down the back stairs of the executive mansion, cross the service courtyard in the early grey light, and empty this bucket into the privy pit at the far end of the south grounds, and then you're going to come back inside and do it again, possibly 3 more times before breakfast. This is your job. You're a servant in the White House in February of 1829, and you would like you to understand something before we go any further. Nobody told you about the bucket. When your cousin's friend's acquaintance arranged the position, he said the words, household staff, and let your imagination fill in the rest. Your imagination filled in something involving livery coats and quiet importance and proximity to greatness. Your imagination did not include the bucket. Outside, Washington City is waking up. The sun is not yet properly over the horizon, just a grey lightening in the east, and the air is cold enough to hurt the back of your throat when you breathe it in. February in this part of the world has a particular nastiness to it. Not the clean cold of a Tennessee mountain winter, but a wet, penetrating cold that seeps through your coat and your shirt and settles in your bones like it intends to stay. The grounds of the White House are not what you expected. The south side, the view that faces the river, is mostly mud at this time of year. The formal gardens that are supposed to be here exist in theory and in the plans drawn up by various superintendents. But in practice what you have is frozen mud, several dead-looking shrubs, a kitchen garden that has been picked over and now looks like the aftermath of something, and the privy structures themselves which are wooden and have seen better years. The smell of the privy reaches you before you reach it. And when I say smell, I need you to understand what that means in February of 1829. This is not the casual discomfort of a public restroom. This is a pit, a deep one, that has been receiving the waste of the entire White House for years, and the cold only partially suppresses what rises from it. And when the lid of the wooden seat is lifted, what comes up to meet you is something ancient and fundamental and deeply, deeply incompatible with the idea that this is supposed to be the grandest house in the Republic. You empty the bucket, you replace the lid, you breathe through your mouth for a while. This is the White House, and this is where you live now. So, I make these history stories, and I genuinely wonder sometimes about you. Maybe you are a person who goes to sleep easily and just likes the sound of someone talking. Maybe you are a person who cannot sleep and this is your last resort. Or maybe, and I suspect this is a meaningful percentage of you, you're specifically the kind of person who wants to know what it actually smelled like in the White House when Andrew Jackson was in charge, and whether the rumours about his personal hygiene are as bad as you have heard. They are worse. Get comfortable. Here we go. We need to go back about 3 weeks before the bucket to when you first arrived in Washington, before you understood what you'd agreed to, when you still thought this was going to be something other than what it turned out to be. You got here in early February of 1829 on the back of a supply wagon coming up from Baltimore. The last 40 miles of the road into Washington were bad enough that 3 different times the driver had to get down and push, and you had to get down and push with him. And by the time the city came into view, you were muddy to the knee and cold through, and in a mood that a more educated man might have called existential. Washington City in 1829 is difficult to describe to someone who's never been here, and not in a good way. You have heard of great cities. You have heard of Philadelphia and New York and Baltimore. Cities with real streets and real buildings and the sense that human ambition has been concentrated into physical form. Washington City is not that. Washington City is a plan, a very optimistic plan that has been partially executed and then largely abandoned to the mud and the weather and the competing demands of a young country that has a great deal going on and not much money to spend on civic improvements. The city was designed by a French engineer named Pierre-Charles L'Enfant, who drew up a magnificent grid of diagonal avenues intersecting in grand circles, with a capital at one end and an executive mansion at the other, and elegant parks and fountains and the infrastructure of a great capital between them. What L'Enfant drew and what exists in 1829 are two very different things. Pennsylvania Avenue, the main road between the Capitol and the White House, is about 1.5 miles long. Parts of it have been paved, parts of it have been gravelled, parts of it are simply packed earth that turns to thick brown mud in wet weather, which in February means almost always. The Grand Boulevard L'Enfant envisioned has open drainage ditches along both sides that carry away everything the city produces. And what the city produces is, broadly speaking, exactly what you would expect from 40,000 people living in close proximity without adequate sanitation. The smell of Pennsylvania Avenue in wet weather is something you will never fully shake from your memory. It sits somewhere between river mud and something more organic, more human, a smell that your nose registers as wrong in a way that bypasses thought entirely and goes straight to instinct. You walk quickly. Everyone walks quickly on Pennsylvania Avenue in February. Buildings line parts of the avenue, not the grand public buildings of a capital city. Those are mostly still being built, perpetually being built. It seems like they have always been building the capital and always will be. But the ordinary commercial buildings of a working city, taverns, boarding houses, a few shops, a market, a hotel or two. Between the buildings, there are gaps, empty lots where the grass has died and the mud has taken over. Pigs root through garbage in the street. You had heard about the pigs. You had not fully appreciated the pigs until you saw them. There are a lot of pigs in Washington City. They are doing what pigs do, which is eat everything they can find, and what they can find is distributed liberally across every street in the capital of the United States. The White House sits at the end of the avenue, separated from the street by grounds that in summer are probably somewhat presentable, and in February look like the site of a building project that was abandoned before completion. The house itself, the executive mansion, the president's house, what most people in this era call the president's house, because the term White House has not yet become standard, is large. Larger than you expected. The sandstone exterior has been painted white since the reconstruction after the British burned it in 1814, and even in the grey February light it stands out from the muddy, half-built city around it. There is something almost surreal about it. This finished, imposing, white-painted thing in the middle of what is frankly a work in progress. You arrived at the service entrance on the east side as directed. You gave your name. You gave the letter of introduction. A thin man with ink stains on his fingers and an expression that suggested he had heard about too many cousins of too many friends looked you over for a long time. "Can you lift?" he asked. "Yes, sir." "Can you follow instructions without asking questions?" You thought about this. "Yes, sir. The president moves in day after tomorrow. We need every hand we can get." That was how you became household staff at the White House. Not through any special connection or skill. Through proximity and willingness, and the fact that you were there, which in the chaotic weeks before Andrew Jackson's inauguration was the most important qualification of all. In those first days before Jackson arrived, the mansion was in a particular state of organised upheaval. Furniture was being moved. Rooms were being cleaned with a thoroughness that suggested they had not been cleaned quite this thoroughly before. The kitchen staff, who worked in the basement under conditions that would have been familiar to anyone who had ever tried to cook large quantities of food using fireplaces and inadequate ventilation, were in a state of constant motion and loudly expressed opinion. The kitchen was run by a woman named Margaret, who had been in the house before Jackson arrived and would remain in it through administrations that she discussed with a diplomatic vagueness suggesting she found their relative merits difficult to rank. She was a solid woman in her 40s with forearms that suggested her relationship with physical labour was of long standing, and she had strong opinions about everything, which she delivered not as complaints, but as statements of fact about the condition of the world. The flues do not draw, she told you on your third day, which was the first day you worked in the kitchen proper. The range smokes. The root cellar floods in wet weather, which is always, and there is no good place for a dairy. She handed you a pot that was heavier than you expected because things in her kitchen were always heavier than you expected. Do not set that down until you reach the scullery, she said, and wash your hands before you come back. The pump for hand washing was in the scullery, a small cold room off the main kitchen. The water it produced was cold and slightly brown, and came from the well in the north grounds through a pipe that ran underground and which, you would later learn, had a tendency to freeze in hard winter. On frozen pipe mornings you carried water from the well directly. This was a considerable distance with a full bucket. Your shoulders learned new things about themselves in those first weeks. There were 10 other servants working the main house when you arrived, not counting the kitchen staff, which was a separate category in Margaret's accounting of the world. 3 chambermaids, 2 footmen, a porter who managed the front entrance and who had strong opinions about who was and was not admitted to which parts of the building, a laundress named Cecilia who worked in the basement laundry and who could look at a stained shirt and tell you immediately what had caused the stain and how best to address it, which was a specialised knowledge that turned out to be genuinely useful. They came from different places and had different stories about how they had come to be here. One of the chambermaids was from Maryland, where her family had worked in service for 3 generations. One of the footmen was from Virginia, where he had worked at an estate whose name he did not mention, and about which he said nothing beyond that he had preferred to be elsewhere. Cecilia had been in the building for 7 years and knew where everything was and had opinions about where everything should be, that did not always align with where everything actually was. You were the newest. This was the first thing you were in the hierarchy of that household. Not the youngest, but the newest. And newest meant you learned things in a specific order, which was the order of tasks that nobody else wanted. The bucket was the first lesson. The inauguration of Andrew Jackson on March 4th, 1829, is one of those events that has become almost mythological in American history. You will spend the rest of your life telling people you were there, and they will ask what it was really like, and you will have to decide which parts to leave out. You leave out the smell mostly. It is too hard to explain. The day itself began cold and grey, which was appropriate. Washington had been filling up for weeks. People came from every state in the Union, from the farms and the frontier and the western territories. People who had voted for Jackson because Jackson was theirs, not a Virginia aristocrat, not a Massachusetts lawyer, but a man from the West, a man who had survived things that would have killed most people twice over, a man who had fought and bled and won, who was rougher and harder and more genuinely American than anything the Eastern establishment had ever produced. They came to see him take power. There were 20,000 of them, maybe more. The exact number is impossible to establish because nobody thought to count carefully, and also because counting 20,000 people who are not standing still is not an activity that produces reliable results. They lined the streets. They stood on boxes and barrels. They climbed fences. They pressed forward against the wooden barriers that had been set up around the Capitol steps, and the barriers flexed and bent and in some places gave way entirely, and the crowd pressed further forward, and nobody was in charge of any of it. You watched from the south side of the Capitol grounds, where you'd been stationed along with a dozen other household staff to help manage the inevitable aftermath. You could not hear the speech. You were too far back and the crowd noise was too loud, and the wind was blowing in the wrong direction. What you could see was a tall figure in black, hatless, grey-haired, who moved slowly through the crowd with an air of complete, almost frightening calm. This was your first clear view of Andrew Jackson. He was 61 years old and he looked like a man who'd been put through something. His face was deeply lined, hollowed in a way that made the cheekbones stand out. His white hair was thick and stood almost straight up, which would later be described by a painter as leonine, and which in person looked more like the hair of someone who'd been startled repeatedly over a period of decades and never quite recovered. He was very tall. He moved with a kind of careful deliberateness that you had come to understand was the movement of a man managing chronic pain. He took the oath. The crowd erupted. And then the crowd decided that they were going to the White House. Here is where I need you to understand something. When the new administration planned the inauguration reception, they had in mind a manageable celebration at the executive mansion. Some refreshments, some handshaking, the appropriate ceremonies of a democratic transfer of power. They had not accounted for the 20,000 people. The gates of the White House were open. They were supposed to be open. This was a public reception after all. This was the people's house. This was democracy in action. But when 20,000 people decide to walk through the same two gates at the same time, what you get is not a reception. What you get is something closer to a siege. You were inside when it started. You were in the East Room, where tables had been set up with food and drink, where the punch bowls were positioned and the cakes arranged, and the general air was one of tentative, about-to-be disrupted order. You saw the first wave come through the door and you knew, in the way that you sometimes just know things, that this was not going to go the way anyone planned. The first people through the door were respectable enough. Men in good coats, women in their best dresses, people who had travelled some distance and who understood themselves to be guests at a historic occasion. They came in and they looked around and they tried to find the punch and the cake. Then the second wave came in, and the third. The room was enormous by any standard outside of a European palace, and it was full in about 20 minutes. Not comfortably full. Full in the sense that the air inside had become notably warmer, and the sound had climbed to a level where you could not hear the person next to you without them shouting, and the press of bodies was starting to push the tables sideways, and the punch bowls were being drained faster than anyone had prepared for. People were climbing on the furniture to see over the crowd. Fine furniture. Chairs that had been imported at considerable expense. You watched a man in muddy boots stand on a settee to get a better view of Andrew Jackson and crack the seat with his weight, and then shrug and step down and push his way in a different direction. The mud. That was the thing that would stay with you. The 20,000 people had been walking through Washington City on a February day, and Washington City in February is not a place where you can avoid mud. They brought it inside with them. They brought it on their boots. on the hems of their coats, on their hands. Within an hour, the floor of the East Room, which had been cleaned that morning and which would need to be recleaned for weeks, was a landscape of footprints and puddles, and something that was definitely not just mud. There was an older man near the centre of the room who had fallen against a table and knocked a punch bowl sideways, and who was now standing in a spreading puddle of sweetened wine, looking mildly surprised, while the flow of bodies around him continued undisturbed. A child had gotten separated from whoever brought it and was crying near the window, not loudly enough to be heard over the general roar. 2 women were pressed against the wall to the left of the main doors with the expressions of people who had come with expectations and were now revising them rapidly. The food disappeared with an efficiency that defied understanding. Cakes went first, then cold meats, then anything else within reach. The punch, which had been prepared in what you'd thought were enormous quantities, was gone within the first 40 minutes. When the empty bowls were brought back to the kitchen, and the question arose of what to fill them with, the general consensus was chaos. Margaret's voice from the kitchen, when this became clear, had a quality you could hear from 2 rooms away over the noise of 20,000 people. Jackson himself had to escape. The man who had led armies and defeated the British and survived multiple bullet wounds and duels beyond counting, had to be removed from his own reception through a side entrance, because the crowd pressing to get near him had become dense enough to be genuinely threatening. He was pushed against a wall at one point, which is a thing that should probably not happen to the President of the United States on his inauguration day. Gentlemen formed a human chain with arms linked to push back the crowd and create space for him to move. He left through a window. There is historical debate about which window. The weight of evidence suggests a ground floor window on the south side. He climbed through and was helped down into the garden and was walked rapidly to the boarding house nearby where he'd been staying before his formal move into the mansion. Inside, the reception continued without him. The crowd did not immediately realize he was gone. They continued to press toward where he'd been standing, and then sort of redistributed through the available space, filling every room they could access. Some went upstairs, some went into the offices, someone went into a room that was definitely not part of the reception, and emerged looking confused. Eventually the servants, working in consultation with whatever men still had authority in the building, moved the punch bowls outside onto the lawn. The crowd followed the punch. The house began slowly, reluctantly to empty. You spent the rest of that day cleaning. You spent the better part of the following week cleaning. Servants, including you, spent the better part of the following week finding things in places they were not supposed to be. Muddy footprints on every surface, items missing from tables, not through malicious theft necessarily, but through the kind of casual acquisition that happens when 20,000 people are in a space that fits 2,000. Broken china, a cracked window, upholstery that would not fully clean no matter what was applied to it. Cecilia in the laundry had a particular vocabulary for this period. She expressed it in the mornings when the work piled up, and in the evenings when it was still not done, and at no point during those 2 weeks did the vocabulary change character, which was impressive in its consistency. The White House smelled like tobacco and mud, and 20,000 people for a week. That was the beginning. Your actual duties in those first weeks were not what anyone had precisely defined, which turned out to mean that your duties were whatever anyone needed doing at any given moment. You cleaned floors. You carried things from one part of the mansion to another. You helped in the kitchen when Margaret required additional hands, which was frequently because the kitchen was not adequately sized for what it was being asked to do and required human ingenuity and additional people to fill the gap between what it was and what it needed to be. You learned what Margaret's various silences meant. A short silence meant she was thinking. A longer silence meant something had gone wrong. A silence accompanied by the deliberate setting down of whatever she was holding meant something had gone significantly wrong, and you should identify a useful task and be seen performing it immediately. You also helped with the water. There was no running water in the White House. Water came from the well in the north grounds, or sometimes from a water wagon that made deliveries from the public pumps. It had to be carried in, bucket by bucket, to wherever it was needed. The kitchen, the bathing room when that was being used, the bedrooms for washing basins, the laundry. On a busy day, you might carry 40 or 50 buckets of water. Your shoulders ached in a way that had become so constant you no longer noticed it, like a background noise that your brain had stopped registering as unusual. The calluses on your hands had developed calluses of their own. The skin on your knuckles cracked in the cold, dry air of the mansion's interior, and sometimes bled a little, and this was just something that was true about your hands now. You did not complain. Nobody complained. Complaining was not the culture of this household. What the culture of this household was in those early weeks was a kind of perpetual managed chaos. Jackson had arrived with a large circle of friends and associates and political supporters and hangers-on, all of whom seemed to feel that their proximity to the new president entitled them to certain amenities, and none of whom could quite agree on what those amenities were or who was responsible for providing them. A man named William Lewis practically lived in the mansion without any clear official role. John Eaton, who had just become Secretary of War, was in the building at all hours. There were Tennessee men everywhere, people who had known Jackson for decades and who treated the White House with the familiarity of an old friend's farmhouse. The Eaton situation changed the emotional temperature of the household in ways that were difficult to describe to someone who had not been inside it. John Eaton had married a woman named Margaret O'Neill Timberlake in January of 1829, 2 months before the inauguration, and the question of whether Mrs. Eaton was socially respectable enough to be acknowledged by the wives of the other cabinet members became, within months of Jackson taking office, the central crisis of the administration. Not a military crisis, not a financial crisis, a social one. A question of who would sit next to whom at dinner and who would call on whom in the afternoons, and whether the Vice President's wife would acknowledge the Secretary of War's wife in public. This sounds, from a distance of nearly 2 centuries, as if it cannot possibly have been as serious as the historical record suggests. You can assure anyone who thinks this that it was exactly as serious as the historical record suggests, and possibly more so. What the Eaton affair meant, from where you stood in the corridor and the kitchen and the side rooms of the mansion, was a constant hum of political pressure that never entirely resolved. Jackson, who was loyal to Eaton and outraged on his behalf, and who saw in the treatment of Margaret Eaton a mirror of the treatment his own wife Rachel had received from Washington society, was in a state of sustained fury that did not ebb noticeably from 1 month to the next. He was angrier about this some days than you saw him about things that seemed on their surface more consequential. The household felt this, not directly, not in the sense that he spoke to the staff differently, but the rhythm of the house reflected the rhythm of the man who ran it, and when the man who ran it was in a state of sustained outrage, the house moved with a particular kind of tension. Voices lowered in the corridors. Tasks were completed with more precision than usual. Margaret in the kitchen, who had an extremely accurate sense of what mood the house was in, communicated the status of that mood through her commentary on unrelated subjects. On the mornings when she was short with the kitchen girls about bread that had not risen quite right, you knew the previous day had been difficult. On the mornings when she sang very quietly to herself while she worked, you knew things were temporarily better. The morning that Vice President Calhoun's letter was circulated, the one that made it clear that Calhoun had been working against Jackson's interests since the Seminole affair, Margaret did not speak at all for most of the morning. This was its own category of information. The staff did not discuss the political situation directly, not because they had been told not to, but because it was understood that the political situation was not their territory, and that having opinions about it, or being heard to have opinions about it, was a form of exposure that served no one. What you talked about was the work. Whether the linen press in the upper hall needed repair, whether the well pump was making the sound again, whether the delivery from the market had included what was ordered, or whether you would need to send someone back. These were safe conversations. The political situation was not safe in the way that work was safe. But you listened. You were in rooms where things were said, and you were carrying something or straightening something, and you were the kind of person that people spoke in front of, because people in positions of power tend not to account for the full attention of the people who serve them. This was not a slight. It was simply that they were thinking about other things, and so you heard things. You heard Major Donaldson's assessment of the cabinet, offered in a low voice to someone you could not see from where you were standing. You heard Jackson's voice rise on a Tuesday afternoon behind a door that was not quite fully closed, the specific register of his anger when it was real anger rather than performed anger, and the distinction was clear once you'd heard both enough times. You heard the silence that sometimes filled the blue room after certain visitors left, a silence that had shape and weight. None of this was your business. All of it was part of the education that the job provided, whether or not you had asked for it. You were 22 years old, and you were learning what power looked like when it was not performing. You were learning what it cost. That was a thing worth knowing, even if knowing it came at the cost of carrying many buckets. And somewhere in the middle of all of this was Jackson himself. You met him properly in the second week of March. Not met exactly. Introduced yourself to was not quite right either, because he was the kind of man you did not introduce yourself to so much as present yourself before and hope for the best. It happened like this. You had been sent upstairs with a pile of clean linens, which was a job that normally fell to one of the chambermaids, but which today had fallen to you because everyone else was occupied with something else. You found the bedroom door open, which it should not have been, and you knocked on the door frame before you entered, and when you entered, Andrew Jackson was in the room. He was standing at the window, looking out at the south grounds. He was wearing a dark coat and dark trousers, but no cravat, which for a man of his era and status was the equivalent of standing there in his underclothes. His white hair was loose, not yet arranged. He was holding something in his right hand, and you did not understand at first what it was. Then he turned slightly and the light caught what he was doing. He was chewing tobacco, not a small piece, a substantial plug of it, worked into his right cheek, and as you watched he turned toward the window and ejected a stream of brown juice at the spittoon on the floor beside him. The spittoon was brass, and it had been emptied that morning, and what was in it now was evidence that he had been at this for a while. He looked at you. His eyes were blue, sharp, and in that moment giving nothing away. "You're new," he said. His voice had the Tennessee in it, the soft vowels and the slight burr that you recognize from home, And this was the most surprising thing about him, that he sounded like home. "Yes, sir. President Jackson, sir." You held up the linens as proof of purpose. "I was told the linens needed. Set them there." He gestured at the table by the door without looking away from the window. "You set them there." "Where are you from?" he asked. "Davidson County, sir." Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, but the infrastructure of one. "What part?" "Near Gallatin, sir. My family farms out near the Cumberland." He nodded slowly. He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a bird was doing something in one of the dead-looking south ground shrubs, and he watched it with the focused attention of a man who was thinking about something else entirely. "You know why I stayed here?" he asked. "Not you specifically. More to the room." You did not answer. It did not feel like a question that needed answering. This place. He meant Washington, or maybe the mansion, or maybe the whole enormous project of being president. "Half of them told me not to come, said it wasn't suited to my temperament." He turned from the window then and looked at you directly, and you understood immediately why men followed him. It was not charisma exactly. It was more like a quality of attention. When he looked at you, he was actually looking at you, not through you or past you or at the version of you that might be useful to him. For that moment, you were the only thing in the room. "It's suited to my temperament fine," he said. "I'm just not suited to their ideas of what this place should be." He picked up the spittoon from beside the window and moved it to the side table and set it down with a small, precise thud. "Get yourself assigned properly," he said. "Don't be running errands for everyone and their cousin. Find your job and do it." You were out of the room before you quite realized you'd moved. Your job, once assigned properly, was in the household staff directly under Major Donaldson, Jackson's nephew by marriage and one of his personal secretaries. This meant you were close to the domestic machinery of the mansion itself. You helped with the daily cleaning. You assisted with the preparation of Jackson's rooms. You carried messages and small items from one part of the building to another. You ran errands to the market and to various other establishments in Washington City when the household required something from outside. And you learned, over the following weeks, what it actually looked like to maintain the life of this particular man. Let me tell you about the tobacco. You already knew that men in this era chewed tobacco. You had grown up around men who chewed tobacco. It was a common thing, unremarkable, something men did the way they breathed or ate. But what Andrew Jackson did with tobacco was of a different order entirely. He chewed constantly, not just after meals or in leisure moments, throughout the day, in meetings, while reading papers, while signing documents, while receiving visitors, while walking through the mansion's corridors. The plug lived in his right cheek with the permanence of a feature of the landscape. The consequence of this was the spittoons. There were spittoons in every room Jackson used regularly. Brass ones, some of them quite fine, placed at intervals calculated to ensure that he was never more than a few feet from a receptacle. There was one by his chair in the office, one by the window, one beside his bed. 2 in the study. The one in the dining room was particularly large, as if whoever ordered it had a realistic assessment of what was needed and then added some margin for error. Your understanding of the spittoon situation deepened over the first 2 weeks in a way that was educational if not enjoyable. The spittoons had to be emptied and cleaned every morning, every evening, and sometimes in between. This task fell to the household staff, which on certain days meant you. You learned to carry a spittoon at arm's length, because the angle mattered, and the angle mattered because of the contents, and the contents were not something you wanted to discuss at length. You learned to breathe through your mouth while cleaning one. You learned that the inside of a well-used brass spittoon has a smell unlike anything else in human experience, a smell that combines tobacco and something more biological, in a ratio that produces an olfactory experience your brain categorizes immediately and permanently as unacceptable. But you cleaned them every day, because that was the job. And Jackson kept producing material for them at an impressive rate. His tobacco of choice was a dark leaf from somewhere in the south, brought to him in packages that arrived with his correspondence. He went through considerable quantities of it. When he was agitated, and Andrew Jackson was frequently agitated, because Andrew Jackson had a quality of engagement with the world that meant he was almost never entirely calm, his consumption increased noticeably. You learned to gauge his mood partly by the spittoon volume. Heavy spittoon day meant the president was in a difficult mood. There were many difficult moods in those first months. The tobacco also had consequences for his teeth, which were in a condition that had been problematic for years before he arrived at the White House, and did not improve during his time there. His lower teeth were largely gone. The uppers were compromised. He had partial dentures, false teeth made from a combination of materials including ivory, which was common in this era, fitted over the remaining stumps of his natural teeth. What happens to a mouth when you chew tobacco heavily for decades is not a gentle story. The tobacco staining is the visible part, a dark, persistent discoloration that does not clean away. But underneath that there is the structural damage, the constant mechanical action of chewing on one side, the chemical effects of the tobacco on the gum tissue, the interaction with whatever dental work had been attempted in the years before modern dentistry existed in any meaningful sense. Jackson's teeth hurt him. You could tell this without being told, from the way he sometimes held the left side of his jaw carefully when eating, from the specific tension around his mouth on certain mornings, from the small, careful way he sometimes worked his jaw when he thought no one was watching. His breath, in consequence, was a sensory experience. Not dramatic, not in a way you could specifically identify a name. Subtle enough that you could not say exactly what it was, only that there was something, a presence before the presence, the combination of tobacco and the state of his mouth, and what his physicians were giving him medicinally, producing something that moved through a room slightly ahead of him. You learned to position yourself at receptions and in small rooms, at angles that required some thought. You saw him work, not performing work, not receiving visitors while papers sat on the desk in a way that suggested work was being done nearby, actually working. Sitting at the desk in the office with papers spread across it and a pen in his hand, and the expression of a man doing something he found genuinely difficult and was not going to be defeated by. Jackson was not a natural administrator. This was something you understood gradually, over weeks, not because anyone said it directly, but because you could see it in the way the office functioned. He preferred to be in motion, to make decisions at speed, to act. The paperwork that governance required, the letters and the reports and the appointments and the petitions and the official communications in both directions, this was not where his nature lived. But he did it, every day. He sat at the desk and he worked through it. He had help. Major Donaldson served as his private secretary and handled much of the correspondence, drafting replies that Jackson would review, correcting them in his distinctive hard-pressing hand, sometimes writing long passages of his own, in a script that was energetic and not particularly legible. Van Buren was useful to him in ways that Calhoun had not been. The men who constituted his real inner circle, Lewis, Donaldson, a few others, were in and out of the office at intervals that reflected how much was being decided on any given day. On the days when things were being decided, the office had a different quality. Voices lower, pauses longer. The particular sound of men who are thinking very carefully before they speak. On an ordinary administrative day, the office was something else. A place where one man was doing the unromantic work of running a country, one letter at a time. You were sent to the office on regular occasions because there was always something to bring or collect. Water for the pitcher, a fresh candle, some document that needed to go to another part of the building. You moved through the room as you moved through all rooms, efficiently, without drawing attention, completing the task and leaving. But efficiency does not prevent observation, and what you observed over the weeks and months that accumulated into years was a man in his office. He read slowly, not in the sense of struggling with the words, in the sense of a man who had learned that reading slowly was the correct response to documents that had legal and political and personal consequences. He would read something twice, sometimes 3 times. He would set it down and look at the wall for a moment. Then he would pick it up again. His handwriting under pressure was difficult. Not difficult the way bad handwriting is difficult. Difficult the way very intense handwriting is difficult. The letters pressing hard enough into the paper that you could feel the indentations from the back side. The ink thick in places because the pen had slowed for emphasis. When he was writing something he felt strongly about, you could hear it sometimes, not the words, the sound of the pen against the paper, a particular kind of pressure. He kept a miniature portrait of Rachel on his desk, a small oval about the size of a pocket watch. It had been done before her death, which meant it showed her as a younger woman, not the woman who had come to Washington and found the Washington press waiting for her. The woman before all of that. He did not look at it constantly, but it was there, and he knew it was there, and on certain days when a particular kind of weariness settled into the way he was sitting, you would notice that the miniature was where his eyes went when they were not on the paper. It was not something you thought about at the time. You were 22 and then 23 and then 24, and the work was the work and the days were the days. But later, after 8 years had passed and you had reason to look back at what you had seen, it was the office you remembered more than the formal rooms. A man at a desk with papers and a pen and a small portrait of someone who was not there anymore. Running the country with very bad posture because his injuries made sitting upright for long periods uncomfortable, and not complaining about it once. There was a dinner in late April, the first formal dinner of Jackson's presidency that you were part of managing from the household side, and it is worth describing because it reveals something about what the White House actually was as a social institution in this period. The dinner was for 12 guests, senators and their wives primarily, the kind of gathering that was part of the ordinary business of executive governance. The table in the state dining room was set by people who knew how these things were done. China had been ordered and delivered. Crystal, silverware that was polished that morning until it caught the light the way Major Donaldson required it to catch the light. The kitchen worked for 2 full days on the food. Margaret directed this production with the focused intensity of a general managing a campaign, and the analogy is not casual. A formal dinner in this era for 12 guests requires a level of culinary effort that is difficult to fully appreciate. Soup, fish, brought up from the river market at considerable effort and expense. 2 kinds of roasted meat, vegetables in season, which in late April meant not very many vegetables of interest, bread, rolls, biscuits, puddings and pies and small sweet things for the dessert course, all of it produced in a basement kitchen with wood-burning fireplace ranges, no thermometers, no timers beyond the cook's internal sense of time, no refrigeration, and the ever-present challenge of the Washington spring, which was warm enough to cause concerns about food held for any length of time. You were in the room for the dinner itself, standing at the wall with two other staff whose job was to be present in case something was needed, and invisible when nothing was needed. The guests arrived. They arranged themselves around the table. They produced the conversation of people who understood that this was both a social gathering and a political event, and who managed both registers simultaneously with the practiced ease of people who had been doing this their whole adult lives. Jackson sat at the head of the table. He was in his formal clothes, which were dark and well-tailored, and nothing like the rough-edged public figure the Eastern newspapers sometimes depicted. He was, when the occasion required it, entirely capable of behaving in the manner the occasion required. He conversed. He attended to the guests nearest him. He was to all observable evidence a president receiving senators for dinner. But you noticed the spittoon. It was positioned under the table to his right, within easy reach. No one acknowledged it. No one looked at it. It was simply there, as unremarkable as the salt cellars and the water glasses, a working piece of equipment in a room full of working pieces of equipment. When he used it briefly during a pause in the conversation, he used it with the same absence of drama with which he did everything habitual. And then he turned back to the table and continued the conversation. The senator he had been speaking to, a man from Virginia with the kind of face that expressed his opinions without requiring the assistance of words, watched this with an expression that passed through something close to surprise and arrived at something close to studied neutrality. You looked at the wall. The guests at the dinner discussed the tariff question, and the Western Territories, and the matter of the National Bank, which Jackson had views on that were not subtle, and which the senators at the table had views on that were also not subtle. And the conversation moved through these subjects with the careful choreography of men who understood that the dinner was doing work that the Senate chamber could not do as efficiently, the work of reminding each other that they were people, not positions, and that this had occasionally mattered in the past and might matter again. You stood at the wall and watched. A footman's job at a state dinner is to be a solution to problems that have not yet occurred. You stand ready. You watch for a glass that needs filling, a dish that has been finished and wants clearing, a guest who has the expression of someone who needs something and has not yet articulated what. You learn, over enough state dinners, to read the room in a way that is almost architectural, to understand the social structure of 12 people around a table the way you understand the physical structure of a building, to know where the weight is, where the tension is, where something is about to shift. The wine was poured. The soup was good because Margaret had spent 2 days ensuring that it was good. The fish arrived and was placed correctly, which required a specific kind of care, because there was a right way to present a dish at a formal dinner and several wrong ways, and the distinction mattered to Major Donaldson in a way that he had made very clear during the afternoon. Halfway through the second course, Jackson reached down and used the spittoon. He did it simply, without ceremony. Mid-sentence, in the direction of a Virginia senator whose name you did not retain, he turned fractionally and discharged and turned back and continued the sentence. The Virginia senator had the expression of a man who has just processed something unexpected and is deciding how to process it which took approximately 2 seconds and then became a studied neutrality that was itself a kind of decision. The other guests had their own versions of this process, some faster than others. The senators who had met Jackson before were faster. The wives who had been briefed by their husbands were faster than the ones who had not. By the time the third course arrived, the room had absorbed the information and moved on, because that was what this room did. Absorbed information and moved on, and in the morning the account that would circulate in the drawing rooms of Washington would include the spittoon, because it always did, because it was the kind of detail that attached itself to Andrew Jackson in the telling and the retelling of stories about him. You cleared the used plates from the right side. You poured water for the woman who preferred water. You were invisible in the way the job required, present enough to function and absent enough not to exist. After the guests left and the table was being cleared, Thomas looked at you across the emptied plates and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. You both understood what had just occurred. A dinner had been served. A country had been run, informally and at close quarters, over 2 hours and 4 courses and a great deal of wine and one notable use of a spittoon. This was the work. By late March, you had been assigned to assist specifically with the preparation and maintenance of Jackson's private rooms, which meant you had an intimate view of what his morning actually looked like. He woke early. This is the first thing to understand. This was not a man who lay in bed. Whatever else the critics said about Jackson, and by 1829 there were many critics saying many things, he did not lie in bed. He was typically up before 6, and on days when his health permitted, he was out of bed by 5:30, dressed and working. His health. This is where it gets complicated. Andrew Jackson in 1829 was a man who should, by any reasonable medical assessment, have been considerably less alive than he was. He had been shot twice. This was not in itself an unusual accomplishment for a man of his era and profession, but the manner of his injuries was unusual. The bullet from his 1806 duel with Charles Dickinson had lodged in his chest cavity near his heart, near enough to his heart that the surgeons of the time had unanimously declined to attempt removal. The bullet had sat there for 23 years by the time he took office, working its slow influence on the surrounding tissue, occasionally causing the coughing fits that produced the blood-flecked handkerchiefs that were a regular feature of his mornings. He also had a bullet in his arm from the brawl with the Benton brothers in 1813, which was a separate story involving the kind of street violence that would be alarming even by the standards of an era when street violence was rather more common than it is now. That bullet would eventually be removed. It was taken out in 1832, but in the early months of 1829 it was still in there, and you could occasionally see him rolling his shoulder in a particular way that suggested it was making itself felt. His regular complaints, in addition to the bullet-related ones, included chronic coughing, headaches that on bad days left him confined to his room, abdominal pain that was probably an old intestinal infection that had never fully resolved, and the swelling of his lower legs that came and went, and that his doctor attributed to various causes depending on the day. His doctor was a man named James Bronaugh in this early period. What he and the other physicians who attended Jackson shared was the basic therapeutic toolkit of early 19th century medicine, which was, to describe it charitably, aggressive. The morning medical routine was something you witnessed regularly within your first month at the White House, because it happened early and it happened often, and your duties brought you into and out of Jackson's rooms during those early hours. You learned to knock and wait. You learned which sounds meant enter and which meant not yet. You learned to be efficient once you were inside, because a man with a bullet near his heart and a full schedule of running the country did not benefit from people lingering. The doctors prescribed calomel. Calomel is mercury chloride. In 1829, it is one of the most widely used medicines in the American pharmacopoeia. It is given for almost everything: fever, constipation, malaria, dysentery, liver complaints, general debility. Calomel is the standard first response to most of these conditions and many others. What calomel does, which no one in 1829 fully understands, is introduce mercury into the body. Mercury is a heavy metal and it is toxic. The body cannot process it in the way it processes food or water. It accumulates. The symptoms of chronic mercury poisoning include tremors, memory problems, mood instability, excessive salivation, loosening and eventual loss of teeth, damage to the kidneys, damage to the liver, and a range of neurological effects that in severe cases are debilitating. Jackson was taking calomel regularly, had been taking it for years before he became president, through the various ailments of his military and political career, would continue taking it through his presidency and beyond. You did not know any of this at the time. You knew calomel as a medicine that the doctors prescribed and that Jackson took, usually in the mornings, in a preparation mixed with something to make it more palatable. You knew it made him produce a great deal of saliva. You had seen the specific spittoon that was kept in his room and used most heavily in the mornings, and you had a theory about why. The theory was correct. The specific ritual of the calomel dose was not dramatic in itself. A glass of water, a small prepared dose in a paper twist, the act of taking it, then the waiting while the medicine did whatever the medicine was doing, and then the particular requirement of the spittoon, more insistently than usual for a period of 15 or 20 minutes. During those minutes, Jackson remained at the window or in his chair, and his expression was the expression of a man enduring something with the patience of someone who has decided that endurance is the appropriate response and has made his peace with that decision. He did not complain. He appeared to feel, if anything, a kind of impersonal relationship with the difficulties of his body, as if his body were a useful but recalcitrant horse that he'd learned to manage through firmness rather than sentiment. He was also bled. Bloodletting in 1829 is a standard medical practice. The theory behind it, which dates back to ancient Greece and has been modified but not abandoned in the centuries since, is that many diseases are caused by an excess of blood, or by blood that has become corrupt in some way, and the cure is to remove some of it. This is done with a lancet, a small sharp blade, that is drawn across a vein, usually in the arm, and the blood allowed to flow into a bowl until the doctor decides enough has been removed. Jackson submitted to this with remarkable equanimity, given his general attitude toward being physically assaulted. He would sit with his coat off and his sleeve rolled up and hold his arm out and stare at something across the room while the doctor did what he needed to do. He did not wince. He did not look at the procedure. He talked about other things. You were present in the room twice when this occurred, both times for reasons of proximity, and not because you had any medical role, and both times what struck you was the complete absence of drama in his response to what was objectively a significant act. Here was a man allowing another man to cut open his arm and drain his blood into a bowl, and his face showed the mild patience of someone waiting for a slow process to conclude. What the bloodletting did for his health is essentially nothing useful. It weakened him. It added to the anemia that already compromised his energy. The doctors believed it was helping. Jackson believed the doctors, or at any rate he submitted to their authority in medical matters in a way that he submitted to no other authority. And so the bloodletting continued. There was also the milk. He drank milk almost every morning, sometimes mixed with sugar, sometimes warm, apparently on the advice of someone, possibly a physician, possibly his late wife Rachel, who had died the previous December, and whose advice he continued to follow in various small ways as a form of continuing conversation with her memory. The milk was a comfort possibly as much as a medicine. A thing from before all of this. A thing from Tennessee mornings and the ordinary rhythms of a life that had been interrupted by the extraordinary responsibility of being the 7th President of the United States. On bad mornings, the sound of the coughing carried through the door before you reached it. A wet, tearing sound that stopped you in the corridor for a moment before you knocked. You developed the habit of checking, when you entered the room, whether there was a fresh handkerchief on the table. Fresh meant the night had been relatively quiet. A handkerchief with red on it, and you could see the colour even when it had been folded, meant something else. You're going to do something now that requires a certain mental adjustment. You're going to stop thinking of washing as something you do in a shower or a bath, because those do not exist in 1829. And I need you to actually shift your understanding of what daily hygiene means in this era, because it is different in ways that are not always obvious. People in 1829 wash their faces and hands regularly. This is important. The idea that people in this period simply did not wash at all is incorrect. There was a clear social expectation that visible parts of the body, face, hands, neck, should be clean. Cleanliness was associated with respectability and moral worth in ways that made it socially important even if it was not medically understood. What people in 1829 did not do, as a general rule, was immerse their entire body in water on a regular schedule. Full bathing, what we would call taking a bath, was a production. It required water, which had to be carried and heated. It required a tub, which was kept in the bathing room if there was one. It required time and privacy. For a man of Jackson's station, these things were theoretically available, but in practice his health and schedule meant that full immersion baths were rare events rather than routine ones. Weekly at best. Monthly was not uncommon for men of his era and class. The White House had a bathing room of sorts. It had a copper tub. It had a system for filling it with water that still required hauling water from the well to heat on the kitchen fire to carry upstairs, which was a project that required planning and coordination and produced a bath once it was done. On the mornings when a proper bath was prepared for the president, you were sometimes part of the carrying chain. You knew the weight of a full water bucket over multiple staircases. You knew the particular way your shoulders ached differently from water carrying than they did from box carrying. You knew that the water that arrived at the bathing room was never as hot as it had been when it left the kitchen, because that is what happens to hot water when it spends time in a bucket in a cold corridor. Hot water becomes less hot. This was physics, not failure. You carried it anyway. On other mornings, which were most mornings, the cleaning was done at the basin. A ceramic basin and pitcher sat on the washstand in Jackson's room. Water in the pitcher, fresh every morning. He would pour a measure into the basin and wash his hands, his face, his neck. The water afterward was a particular colour that told you what the night had been like. A dark colour meant tobacco stain, and whatever else settled in the creases of a face that had spent considerable time outdoors over the previous 6 decades. A lighter colour meant a better night. His hair required more deliberate attention. The white hair that stood so dramatically, that had become a recognisable feature of his public image, required care to maintain its distinctive form. It was brushed, pomaded slightly to keep it in its upright position, arranged with the focused care of a man who understood that his physical appearance was part of his political identity. People expected Old Hickory to look a certain way. He made himself look that way every morning, regardless of how the morning had started. This was a form of discipline. You recognized it as such even then. His clothing was cleaned by the household laundry staff, which meant by you and several others, in the cavernous basement laundry room where the wash tubs sat and the fires burned under the water heating boilers, and the smell of lye soap was so pervasive it became part of your personal atmosphere. Lye soap is effective at cleaning cloth. It is also effective at cleaning the skin off your hands if you spend enough time with it, and you spent enough time with it. The president's shirts in particular required attention. The white linen shirts that men of his era wore as their closest layer were the garments that absorbed the most of daily life: tobacco, sweat, the saliva that his morning calomel dose encouraged, blood from the occasional bleeding procedure, the kind of staining that required serious application of soap and effort, and a willingness to scrub hard for extended periods while your knuckles complained about it. You scrubbed several times a week. Your hands cracked and bled in the cold, and you wrapped them in linen strips when they got bad, and you kept working. Cecilia, who had been doing this for 7 years before you arrived, showed you the correct technique for a tobacco stain without making it feel like instruction. She simply did it, and you watched, and you understood. She was efficient in a way that had become automatic over years, her hands moving through the task with a rhythm that did not require her full attention, leaving the rest of her mind free to observe the room or think about something else entirely. "The linen wants cold water first," she said once, not looking up from the shirt she was working. "Hot water sets it in, cold water lifts it." She did not add anything to this. She had given you the information. The application was your business. Margaret had a theory about soup. The theory was that you could tell the difference between a household that was functioning and one that was in trouble by looking at its soup. A functioning household made soup from the bones and the ends of vegetables and the things that would otherwise go to waste. And it did this regularly, and the soup was good because it was made from attention and from not letting anything go to nothing. A household in trouble threw away the bones, started with fresh every time, wasted things, treated ingredients as if the getting of them were easy. The soup from such a household was also less good, she said, though whether this was a physical reality or a philosophical position was something she declined to clarify. You thought about this theory for a long time after she first articulated it, and you continued to think about it in the way you think about things that seem to be about one subject, but are actually about something else. She made soup twice a week. The kitchen of the White House was producing meals for the president, for his household, for the regular flow of official visitors, for the staff who worked in the building, and for the various people who attached themselves to the fringes of the administration, in ways that made accounting for how many people would be eating at any given time an exercise in optimism. Margaret planned for more than she expected and consistently had more than she needed, which was the correct approach, and she expressed no particular emotion about this because it was simply how it was done. The kitchen staff ate after the main service, as kitchen staffs do. This meant eating later than would have been ideal from a purely physiological standpoint, and eating what remained after the main preparations, which was not a hardship because what remained after Margaret's preparations was generally good, since she did not make things that were not good, having opinions about this that were non-negotiable. You ate in the kitchen when you could. You ate fast because there was always something after the eating. You learned to appreciate food in the way that people who work very hard learn to appreciate it, which is to say completely and without distraction, because the meal is one of the few parts of the day that is not also something else. On the nights when the kitchen had been producing for a formal dinner, the remains were elaborate. A soup that had been set aside, the end of a roast that had not made it to the table, bread from this morning, which at this point in the day was not fresh but was still bread. These were better than the regular nights, and on these nights you ate well. Thomas, who had been at a Virginia estate before this, and whose baseline for comparison was therefore different, sometimes expressed the view that the food was quite good and that people did not appreciate what they had. Cecilia's response to this, delivered without looking up from her plate, was that people generally appreciated what they had when they thought about what they might have instead, and that thinking about what they might have instead was not always pleasant, and therefore people often did not do it. Margaret, from the other end of the kitchen, said that the soup was the third best she had made this week, and that she intended to do better on Thursday. This was the texture of the evenings. Washington City itself, in the summer of 1829, is worth pausing on for a moment, because the building you live and work in is part of a city that is itself a remarkable thing, and not always in the ways that the founding generation intended. The city sits between two rivers, the Potomac to the south and west, the Anacostia to the south and east. The site was chosen by Washington himself, a compromise between north and south, literally and geographically, and the plan for it was grand. But Washington in 1829 is a city in quotation marks. The physical reality is of a place where the ambition is much larger than the execution. The population is somewhere around 40,000 people, which is substantial, but which means the vast diagonal avenues that L'Enfant planned are not always full of the commerce and traffic they were designed for. Some of them are not full of anything. There are stretches of Pennsylvania Avenue where you can walk for a block and see more weeds than buildings. The city has a geographic challenge that shapes everything else about it. It was built on what was essentially a swamp. The land between the two rivers is low-lying and poorly drained, and in summer it becomes something that residents describe, with remarkable consistency across all their accounts, as intolerable. The heat starts in late June. Washington in July is different from Washington in March in every way, including ones you did not anticipate. The temperature alone would be significant. Temperatures in the 90s are common, sometimes higher, and the buildings have no mechanical cooling of any kind, so whatever the temperature is outside is roughly what it is inside, plus the additional contributions of fireplaces and cooking fires, and the body heat of however many people are in the building. But it is the humidity that makes it what it is. Washington in July is wet in the air. The moisture hangs in everything. Your clothes are damp by mid-morning. Paper in the offices develops a soft quality that makes writing on it difficult. Leather bindings on books swell. Food spoils faster than anywhere you have previously encountered. The smells of the city, which in cool weather were manageable, become in the July heat something else entirely. The privy smell from the south grounds rises more insistently in warm weather. The drainage ditch alongside Pennsylvania Avenue produces its contributions more generously. The river smell from the Potomac when the wind is from the southwest is a thing you learn to identify and to accept, though not to enjoy. The specific and distinctive smell of 40,000 people and their animals and their daily production of waste, concentrated in a geography that was not designed for this level of occupation, becomes, by August, simply the smell of the air. You smelled in the way that people smelled in this era. Not dramatically, not in a way you could notice yourself because you were accustomed to it, but in the way that everyone smelled when regular full bathing was not a daily practice. The smell of bodies after a day's work, of clothes that had been worn for several consecutive days, of hair that was cleaned but not frequently enough to stay quite clean. Everyone smelled like this. The visitors smelled like this. The congressman who came through to petition the president smelled like this. Jackson himself smelled like this. Plus the additional notes of tobacco and something medicinal that you later identified as the particular smell of calomel preparations. At close quarters, and serving the man's household meant being at close quarters, this was simply a feature of the environment. You were sometimes allowed on Sunday afternoons, when your duties permitted, to walk to the rise of ground behind the White House, where you could look south over the grounds toward the Potomac. The city spread around you in partial form. The Capitol dome half finished, always half finished it seemed, the steeples of the churches, the irregular roof lines of the boarding houses and taverns and shops that made up the functional part of the Capitol. The river was silver in the late afternoon light. Ships moved on it. Boats moved on it. The whole thing, the city, the river, the vast forested hills visible across the water in Virginia, had a quality that you found difficult to describe, a quality of being both completely real and somehow not quite finished, like a painting where the foreground is detailed but the background has only been roughly sketched in. This was the capital of the United States, the centre of a democratic experiment that the world was watching to see if it would hold. This city, with its mud and its pigs and its drainage ditches, this building, with its leaky roof and its inadequate well and its spittoons in every room, this man with his bullets and his tobacco and his doctors and his tremendous, exhausting, absolutely undefeated will. The experiment was holding, for now. In the autumn of 1831, a delegation of European visitors came through the White House, part of the kind of diplomatic adjacent visit that Jackson's administration handled with varying degrees of enthusiasm. These were not official ambassadors. They were gentlemen of standing, 3 of them, accompanied by a formal letter of introduction that smoothed their access to the building and to a half-hour audience with the president. They were very well dressed. This was the first thing you registered because you registered such things by profession, having spent years now assessing who was wearing what and whether it required any particular preparation or response. Their coats were of a quality that did not exist in Washington shops. Their boots had a particular sheen that suggested they had a person whose job was to maintain them in that condition, or possibly that they had simply not yet had occasion to walk anywhere that Washington City offered pedestrians, which would account for it. They smelled of something imported and deliberately applied. They stood in the entrance hall while the aide went to confirm the audience, and they looked at what they found themselves standing in with the careful, neutral expressions of men trained from childhood not to let their faces reveal what they were thinking. The cheese was still there. Not the 1835 cheese. That was still 4 years in the future. But there was always something in the entrance hall, some gift from some admiring citizen of the Republic, because Jackson was the kind of figure who inspired that kind of gift. A substantial barrel of something, a mounted exhibit of some kind, the democratic abundance of a young country presenting its president with what it had. The visitors looked at the barrel. They looked at the painted walls. They looked at the furniture, which was the best furniture available in Washington, but which was visibly inferior to whatever they were accustomed to in their home countries. One of them said something in French to another. The second one answered in French in a way that did not require translation. You were carrying something through the entrance hall in the opposite direction, the way you always happened to be carrying something through rooms where interesting things were occurring, and you did not slow down and you did not change your expression. But you watched them from the corner of your vision, because it was interesting to see the White House through eyes that had not lived in it. What they saw was a building that was simultaneously grander and more modest than anything they had expected. The scale was real. The proportions were correct. The Ionic portico and the formal rooms were genuinely impressive in the terms of formal architecture. But the building was also clearly a working place, not a palace. People moved through it with the practical efficiency of a household that was also an office that was also the seat of government. There was always something slightly underdone about the White House, some gap between the formality it aspired to and the informality that a republic produced. And visitors from older countries noticed this gap the way they would notice a crack in a wall that the residents had stopped seeing. The audience lasted 30 minutes. Afterward, the visitors came back through the entrance hall. They moved more quickly this time, and one of them was writing something in a small notebook, which may have been diplomatic preparation, or may have been something else. They did not look at the barrel on the second pass. You held the door for them as they left. The last one paused and looked at you and said something in French that you did not understand. Later, in the kitchen, you told Cecilia about it. "What did he say?" she asked without looking up from the shirt she was working on. "I don't know. French dot." "Probably, 'Thank you,'" she said. That much they know how to say." You thought it might have been something else, but you had no way to know. The servants' quarters were in the basement and on the attic floor, and in the smaller rooms at the east end of the building that were not required for official functions. Your room was on the attic floor, which was cold in winter and hot in summer, and always draughty in the specific way that attic floors are draughty, as if the building has decided that certain kinds of comfort belong to certain floors and is not interested in revising this arrangement. The room was small enough that you could touch both walls if you spread your arms, which you had stopped doing after the first week because there was no useful information to be gained from knowing this repeatedly. You had a cot with a straw tick that had been replaced when you arrived, and that you slept on in a way that had become habitual, which is to say, comfortable in the relative sense of being familiar. You had a trunk for your things, which were not numerous, a peg on the wall, a small window that looked over the north grounds and that let in light in the mornings and cold air in the evenings, and could be blocked with a piece of cloth when necessary. The room next to you was occupied by one of the footmen, Thomas, who was from Virginia, and who snored with a regularity that you had eventually ceased to notice, because the alternative was noticing it every night for 8 years. Cecilia was down the hall. On the first winter she'd been in the building, she said, her room had been so cold that the water in her basin had frozen solid before morning. She had learned since then about a particular rag stuffed in a particular gap in the attic wall that had been placed there by whoever had the room before her, and which, if moved, produced a draught that made the gap between freezing and not quite freezing a matter of real consequence. You had a similar gap in your room. You found it in the second winter and filled it with a piece of cloth and said nothing about it to anyone. On Sunday afternoons, when the duties were done, which was not always but sometimes, the household staff had something approaching leisure time. Not official leisure time, not leisure time that anyone would have written down. But the hour after the midday meal on a Sunday, when the visitors were mostly gone, and Jackson was resting or working quietly, and the formal part of the day was effectively over. What people did with this time reflected who they were. Thomas played cards, usually with the other footmen, and was very good at it, and occasionally would admit this by winning in a way that suggested he could also afford to lose when losing was more useful. Margaret sat in the kitchen and drank tea and read a small Bible that she kept in her apron pocket, not ostentatiously, just the way someone reads something they've been reading for years. One of the chambermaids, the one from Maryland, would sometimes walk to the market on Sundays when it was open and come back with small things, an apple, a piece of cloth, something from a stall that had caught her attention. Cecilia, you learned in the second year, went to a church on F Street whose congregation was largely composed of people in service and a few free persons who lived in the neighbourhood near the Navy Yard. She did not invite you, but one Sunday she mentioned it in passing, in the way of mentioning something that was part of her week, and a few Sundays later you went with her, not entirely sure what had motivated the decision. The church was a small building that smelled of wood smoke and damp wool. The singing was something you had not expected, and which stayed with you afterward in the way that certain kinds of music stay. Not the melody exactly, but the quality of it. The sound of a group of people singing something together with the full weight of their intention behind it. You went back the following Sunday and the Sunday after that. This is the kind of detail that is not in any official record. There is no document that states where the household staff of the executive mansion went on Sunday afternoons. There's no account of what the attic room smelled like in July, or how the gap in the attic wall made a sound in high wind that was somewhere between a whistle and a human voice. These things existed, and then they stopped existing, and the only record of them is in the bodies and memories of the people who were there, which is a kind of record that does not last very long. But they were real. They were the texture of the years. In October of 1829, the bullet in Jackson's arm came up in conversation again. It had been in his arm since 1813, 16 years, and unlike the chest bullet, which was genuinely too dangerous to attempt removal, the arm bullet was more a matter of timing and circumstance. Dr. Harris, who had been consulted on the matter, believed it could come out with acceptable risk. Jackson had been declining to schedule the procedure for reasons he did not explain to the medical staff, and which you suspected had something to do with his general feeling that the remedies were often more dangerous than the complaints. He is going to let them take it out, Major Donaldson told you in November. Not a question, a thing that had been decided. We need to prepare the sitting room. The procedure was performed on a Tuesday morning in the sitting room on the second floor. A table was covered with cloth. Instruments were brought in a box. 3 physicians were present, which in Jackson's case was the right number. 1 to do the work, 1 to assist, and 1 to have someone else to look at when things got difficult. You were not in the room. You were in the corridor, where your job was to wait with additional cloths and a basin and water and whatever else might be needed. The door was closed. What you heard through that door was not very much. Some movement. Voices at a level that did not carry words, and once, not loud, a sharp sound that might have been anything. When the door opened, the physician who came out was carrying something wrapped in cloth, and his expression was the expression of a man who had just done something that needed to have been done and was glad it was over. "The President is resting," he said to you. "Yes, sir." "He may need water." You brought water. Jackson was sitting in the chair by the window. His arm was bandaged from elbow to wrist. He was very pale, which on a man of his complexion was noticeable. His eyes were closed. You set the water on the table. You were turning to leave when he spoke. "Well," he said, not opening his eyes, "that is 16 years of argument settled." In June of 1831, something happened that required everyone in the household to rearrange their understanding of what the next months would look like. Jackson's health, which had been an ongoing management project since the day he arrived, declined sharply. The coughing that had been present since before you arrived became worse. There were nights when you could hear it through the floor from the room below, a sound like something tearing slowly. There were mornings when he did not come out of his rooms until 10 or 11, which for a man who had been characteristically up at 5:30 was a significant change. The physicians came more frequently. Their discussions were held in lowered voices that were not quite low enough. You carried more water during this period. Hot water was being requested for steam inhalation, which the physicians believed helped with the coughing, and the production of steam in useful quantities required more hot water than the usual daily routine. So you heated more water. You carried it upstairs more frequently. Your shoulders stopped complaining because they had run out of new things to say about the situation. You were also sometimes the person who sat outside the corridor while the physicians worked. Not because this was an assigned duty, but because someone needed to be there in case something was needed, and you were usually the someone who was there. On one of those evenings, sitting in the corridor with the hall candle guttering in a draught from somewhere, you heard the physician's voice from behind the door, not the words clearly but the cadences, and then Jackson's voice, shorter, lower, and then nothing for a while. And then the physician again. The door opened. The physician, Dr. Brunel, came out and saw you, and stopped. He was a man in his 40s with the kind of face that suggested he'd been expecting bad outcomes for long enough that bad outcomes no longer surprised him. "He needs rest," the doctor said. "Yes, sir." "And he won't take it." This was not quite a question. "No, sir, he won't." The doctor nodded slowly. He started down the corridor and then stopped and looked back. "The man has been shot twice," he said, "and survived battles that killed thousands of better constituted men, and he has survived through an act of will that I cannot medically explain and do not expect to last indefinitely." He went on down the corridor. You went back to sitting and listening to the quiet from behind the door. The seasons in Washington announced themselves through work. Spring meant mud, which you knew about by the end of the first winter, and which turned out to be worse than you had imagined mud could be. The grounds of the White House in March were not grounds in any gardening sense. They were an area of ground that aspired to groundness and had not yet achieved it. You tracked it in. Everyone tracked it in. The portico steps required cleaning 3 times a day and were still not clean. Margaret had a specific sound she made when people entered the kitchen through the back door without removing their boots that was not quite a word and communicated everything necessary. By April, the grounds found themselves again. The grass that had been invisible under the mud revealed that it had been there all along, persisting without encouragement. The kitchen garden behind the service wing began producing things that improved what came out of the kitchen and improved, by association, the mood in the kitchen. Margaret's relationship with the kitchen garden was complicated, in the sense that she had strong opinions about what should be in it, and the gardener had strong opinions about what was possible, and these two sets of opinions achieved a working relationship that was not always peaceful but produced reasonable outcomes. Summer arrived in Washington not as a season but as a verdict. One morning in late June you walked out into the service courtyard at 6 o'clock, and the air was already warm, already thick, already carrying the particular weight that would not lift for 10 weeks. You stood there for a moment and understood what everyone had told you, and what you had not quite believed until that moment. The smell of the privy structures, which in winter and spring had been manageable, became in summer something that required active management. You were not the person responsible for this management. You were grateful for this. The person responsible was a man named Hammond, who approached the task with a philosophical detachment that you found admirable. In August, you did not think about the smell anymore, not because it had changed, but because your brain had reclassified it as background. The way your brain classifies any sensation that is constant and not immediately dangerous. You breathe through your mouth during certain tasks. You developed preferences about which direction to approach certain parts of the grounds from. These were adaptations, and adaptations are what people do. Autumn was the good season. Everyone agreed on this. The air cleared, the heat broke sometime in September, and then the days were the kind of days that made you understand why people lived in this part of the country. Clear and dry and crisp in the evenings, and beautiful in the specific way of eastern forests, when the light is at the angle it is at in October, and the trees have changed. Jackson was better in autumn. The coughing was better. He came out earlier in the mornings. He walked more in the evenings, sometimes on the south grounds after dinner, a solitary figure in the dusk, and you had learned by year 3 that this was not an invitation for company, and not something to interrupt with a message unless the message was urgent, and you had also learned the difference between urgent and not urgent in this household, which was a knowledge that took time. In the evenings in autumn, before the cold came back, the upstairs rooms had a particular quality. The light came in at a low angle and caught the dust motes in the air, which were always there, and the building had the quality that old buildings have in the early evenings when the day's business is done and the night's quiet hasn't quite settled. A kind of held breath. You noticed this in the 3rd year for the first time, and then every year after that until you left. It was not something you could explain or would have tried to explain. It was just the building in the evenings in the fall being what it was. Winter settled in December and was not dramatic. Washington winters were grey and cold, but not the kind of cold that had teeth. Not the kind of winter you might have grown up with if you had come from somewhere northern. Snow fell and was charming for half a day, and then was not charming. The cold found its way into the attic floor despite the filled gaps, and despite the extra weight of the blanket you had acquired by year 2, and were not sure how to account for. On the cold mornings, the water in the basin on your washstand was cold, in a way that provided a very effective incentive for starting the day quickly. You did not lie in bed in the mornings thinking about what you would prefer to be doing. By the 3rd year, the thinking about what you would prefer was not something that occupied you. This was not resignation. It was something more like settlement, like a house after it has had time to find its foundation. You were here. This was the work. The work was real. That was enough, and on most mornings it was more than enough. There was a night in the 2nd year when you could not sleep. This was not unusual. The attic floor in March had a particular kind of cold that arrived around 3 in the morning, after whatever warmth had accumulated from the day had finally given up and gone somewhere else. You had developed strategies for this. Extra cloth on the bed. The particular configuration of your body that presented the least surface area to the cold. The understanding that if you could get through the first 20 minutes, the cold would stabilize and you could sleep in it, if not warmly, then at least adequately. On this night, the strategies were not working. You lay on the cot and listen to the building. A building this size at 3 in the morning makes sounds that it does not make at other hours. Wood contracting in the cold, the particular creak of a specific stair that you had learned to avoid on the way down because the creak was loud enough to wake people. Water moving somewhere in the pipes with a sound like distant knocking. The wind against the north face finding the gaps that all old buildings accumulate. A sound that was not quite a whistle and not quite a word. You lay there and listened to all of it. Through the thin wall you could hear Thomas breathing the even breath of a man who did not have trouble sleeping, which was information about Thomas that was not entirely welcome at 3 in the morning. At some point, not sure when, you became aware of another sound. It was low and it was coming from below, and it took you a moment to identify what it was. Movement. The specific sound of a person walking deliberately slowly in a room below you. A restless kind of walking, not going anywhere, just moving in a space. You lay very still and listened. The sound continued for perhaps 10 minutes, back and forth. Not agitated, not the walk of someone in distress. The walk of a man who had gotten up because he was not going to sleep and had decided to be awake somewhere other than lying in the dark. In the morning you mentioned nothing. You carried the water, you cleaned the spittoons, you did the work. A few weeks later, on a Sunday when the household had settled into its afternoon quiet, you said to Cecilia, carefully, not leading anywhere in particular, that you had heard someone up in the night, walking. She did not look up from the apron she was hemming. He doesn't sleep, she said. Not well, not consistently. Has a lot to think about, I suppose, and the body remembers what it's been through. Does he do it often? More in winter. She bit through the thread and looked at what she'd done. Spring comes, he sleeps better. Things get better in spring, don't they generally? She was right about that. They generally did. You thought about it sometimes in later years. The President of the United States walking his slow circuit of a room at 3 in the morning, while the building made its sounds around him, and the city slept below, and the country extended in all directions, enormous and complicated and full of things that needed his attention. The bullets in his body, the wife who had been dead a year, the thing he had said once to you, that last night, about having come here with nothing. A man walking in a room in the dark is not a thing that goes in any official account, but it is a thing that happened, and it is a thing that was its own kind of portrait of what this work was. The daytime was the politics and the papers and the visitors and the performance of authority that authority requires. The night time was the building and the cold and the sounds and the particular loneliness of a room that is very far from anywhere that felt like home. You understood, lying on your cot on those nights, that you and the man walking below you shared at least that much. The far from home part, the having come here with not very much part, the being here now and making of it what you could part. It was not nothing as a thing to share, even if neither of you would ever say so. The bullet that was in Jackson's chest had been there since May 30th, 1806. The duel with Charles Dickinson was famous, or rather it was the kind of famous that people speak of in certain tones, not admiring exactly, but awed, the way you are awed by something that exceeded normal human parameters. Dickinson was considered one of the finest pistol shots in the country. There had been a dispute about horse racing, and then about something Dickinson had said or was reported to have said about Jackson's wife Rachel, and Jackson had challenged him, and they had met at dawn in Logan County, Kentucky. and Dickinson had fired first. He hit Jackson in the chest, near the heart. Jackson stood there while the other men on the field stared, certain he was about to fall. He did not fall. He raised his pistol and shot Charles Dickinson, and killed him. Only after Dickinson went down did the people present notice that Jackson's boot was filling with blood, that the front of his coat, which was loose-cut and dark, was dark for additional reasons. He had stood there and killed a man with a bullet already in his chest. He told the story himself occasionally. Not often. He was not a man who talked about his past in the manner of someone who needed admiration. But on an evening in May, when the light through the windows was soft and he was in the sitting room with a small group of the men who served as his inner circle, you were nearby doing something that you had prolonged past its natural conclusion because you were 22 years old, and this was a conversation you wanted to hear. They said I was done, Jackson said. The pipe was in his hand, unlit. He turned it over and over. Every man on that field said I was done. And you weren't done, said Lewis. No. He was quiet for a moment. Dickinson was a better shot than me. That's the truth of it. He could hit a spot on a card at distance. I couldn't do that. So he was always going to hit me, probably going to kill me. I knew that going in. Then why? Because I could take the hit. He said it simply, without particular pride, just as a fact about himself, the way you might state that you were left-handed or that you preferred one road over another. A man like Dickinson, he goes up against someone he knows he can't beat. He flinches. Just a little. Just enough. So I let him shoot. Knew I'd get my turn. The room was quiet. And the bullet. He put his hand over the left side of his chest. Not dramatically. Just placed it there, flat for a moment. I feel it when the weather changes, he said. Cold snaps, mostly. Feels like something pressing from the inside. He picked up the pipe and began the process of filling it, which was methodical, his fingers working with the practiced ease of long habit. My doctors want to take it out, he said. Had a surgeon in last year who was very confident. Young man. Very confident. What happened? I told him if he put his hands on that area of my anatomy, I would shoot him with the other bullet. There was a short, uncertain silence from the assembled men. I was not entirely serious, Jackson said. He lit the pipe. Mostly. The duels deserve more than a passing mention, because the duels are not just biographical colour. They are a window into who this man was and what his body had been through before he ever got to Washington, and into what his body was still carrying when it arrived. The number most often cited is somewhere between 5 and 100, which is obviously not a precise figure. The high estimate includes every affair of honour in which Jackson was involved, including the ones that were settled without shots being fired, which was actually the majority of them. Most affairs of honour in this era were initiated, escalated, and then resolved through the exchange of letters and formal apologies without any shooting taking place. This was the preferred outcome for everyone involved. But Jackson had a particular quality when it came to the not shooting resolution, which was that he was not always willing to settle for it. On a particular evening in autumn, you were in the adjacent room while a group of the Tennessee men were talking, not because you had been assigned to be there, but because the errand that had taken you there had not quite concluded, and the conversation through the half-open door was of a kind you did not often hear. He wrote the letter, one of them was saying, all the proper forms, challenge, terms, the whole thing, delivered it to the general, a pause for drinking. The general read it, set it down, picked up a pen and wrote back, one line. Another pause. Someone laughed softly in anticipation. Said, I accept your challenge and I will be waiting at the appointed place to prove the sincerity of your convictions with your blood or mine. Silence. The man withdrew. Laughter. Most of them withdrew, said another voice. The general's reputation for what happened when they did not withdraw was sufficient. Dickinson did not withdraw. No, and Dickinson was good. Dickinson was actually good. Did not matter. No, it did not. A quiet moment. The fire doing what fires do. You know what he said? Afterward, when they asked him what it felt like to take the ball in the chest and stand there. A short pause. He said he would have stood there and shot Dickinson if he'd had to take a ball through his heart first. The room was quiet enough that you could hear your own breathing. And I believe him, the first man said. God help me, I believe every word of that. The cheese arrived at the White House in January of 1835. You should understand that the cheese is not the kind of thing you see coming. You're going about your ordinary duties, which by 1835 had evolved significantly, because you had been in this household for 6 years, and your role had grown in the way that roles grow when you are reliable and present, and learn to anticipate what is needed before it is asked for. And then there is a cheese, a wheel of cheddar cheese, made by a dairyman named Colonel Thomas Meacham from Oswego County in New York, who had strong opinions about democracy and about Andrew Jackson's presidency, and who had expressed these opinions in the most literal way available to a man who ran a large dairy operation. The specific dimensions of this cheese are as follows. It was approximately 4 feet in diameter. It weighed 1,400 pounds, a weight you will pass in the terms available to you, which are these. A saddle horse weighs about 1,000 pounds. This cheese weighed more than a saddle horse. It was loaded onto a wagon and brought to Washington from New York, which was an undertaking that required structural reinforcement of the wagon and some diplomatic planning around which roads could support the load. It arrived at the White House on a January day, and the question of what to do with it became suddenly and urgently the question of the hour. The answer, which eventually presented itself, was the entrance hall. The cheese was moved into the entrance hall with difficulty that you were part of, using rollers and ropes and more people than seemed necessary, and yet still not quite enough. You remember the texture of the rope through your gloves, the rough hemp biting into your palms despite the wool. You remember the sound of the wooden frame creaking under the weight when it was finally settled, a deep sound more felt in the chest than heard. You remember the smell of it, because a wheel of aged cheddar cheese that size occupies a room with the authority of a very large, very pungent, very confident presence. The smell of 2-year-old cheddar cheese in concentrated form from a wheel that size fills a large space efficiently. The entrance hall smelled of cheese from January until February, when Jackson held a reception and invited the public to come eat it. They came, 10,000 people, roughly, coming through the White House doors to eat a piece of cheese the size of a carriage wheel. The mood was festive. The cheese was consumed in approximately 2 hours. People cut pieces with their knives and with knives that other people had brought for the purpose, and with whatever else was at hand. They ate standing up, talking, moving through the rooms. The floor of the entrance hall afterward required the better part of 2 days to address adequately. The combination of mud and cheese and 10,000 people in wet winter boots produced a surface that was unique in your experience of floor conditions. You were part of the clean-up. You have memories of that floor. The White House smelled of cheese for 3 weeks after the reception. The smell seeped into the curtains and the carpets and the wood of the walls and lingered with the persistence of something that has decided to stay. Visitors in early March still noticed it, which they sometimes mentioned and sometimes diplomatically did not. Jackson seemed not to notice or not to mind. He had other things to think about. He always had other things to think about. The seasons in the White House have a rhythm that becomes, over years, as familiar as the rhythm of your own breathing. Spring brings the mud first, then the green, then the return of the horseflies and the mosquitoes that rise from the low ground around the Potomac and visit the city with democratic generosity. Jackson's health typically improved in spring, with the warmth doing what warmth does for bodies that have been struggling through winter. The coughing lessened. The colour was better. He moved more freely. Summer brought the heat and the diplomatic exodus. Congress in recess. Half the population that can afford to leave Washington does leave it, retreating to places with better air and fewer mosquitoes. Jackson stayed. In the summer evenings, when the upper floors of the mansion were hot in a way that made anything but the most essential movement uncomfortable, he sometimes sat on the north portico in the late light and smoked his pipe and looked at the city. You saw him there sometimes when your duties took you past. He looked on those evenings like a man who was having a conversation with something you could not see. Not unfriendly, just at a distance that had nothing to do with geography. Autumn was the best time. The heat broke usually in September, and the air took on a quality of clarity that Washington lacked at other times of year. The trees along the Potomac turned colour in the October light, in a way that you sometimes stopped to watch when you had a moment, which was not often, but when it happened it was worth noting. Winter came again. Water frozen in the well by early January some years. The fire in the study never quite managing to fully warm the room when the wind came from the northwest. The coughing returning, always, as if it had been waiting patiently for the cold to bring it back. You carried more water. You cleaned more spittoons. You helped prepare more morning basins and carry more hot water for more baths on more cold mornings. You were not unhappy, this is worth saying. The daily labour of maintaining a president's household was substantial and not glamorous, and sometimes unpleasant in ways that are difficult to explain politely. But there was something about the place, about the proximity to the work of governance, even though you yourself governed nothing. About knowing that the papers you saw on the desk, face down as you cleaned around them, were shaping the country you lived in. About the fact that when something mattered, it mattered here. And about Jackson himself. He was extraordinary, not easy, not comfortable, not the person you would choose as a relaxing employer, but extraordinary in the way that people are extraordinary when they've been forged by something into a form that has no give left in it. You do not meet many people like that in a life. You met one. The last year you served at the White House was 1836. Jackson was in his second term, finishing out his presidency, and there was a quality of conclusion to everything that was both a relief and something else, something that does not have a clean name. His health in 1836 was what you had by now come to understand was Jackson's health. Worse than it should have been for a man who was alive, better than it should have been for a man with his medical history and entirely dependent on his will for the latter fact. The coughing was chronic. The swelling in his legs came and went and then came back and stayed a bit longer each time. His physicians muttered to each other in corridors. He kept working. He signed papers. He received visitors. He wrote letters, long letters, forceful letters, letters that his secretaries sometimes had to gentle before sending because the original version said what he actually thought, in terms that diplomatic relations are not designed to withstand. He continued to chew his tobacco and use his spittoon and drink his medicinal milk, and submit to the calomel and the bloodletting, with the same resigned cooperation he had always brought to procedures he did not believe would help, but which he declined to forbid because other people believed they would. In March of 1837, Andrew Jackson left the White House. He had been president for 8 years. He was 70 years old. He was, by all available evidence, in terrible health. He would live until June of 1845. 8 more years. 8 more years past the point where his physicians had largely stopped expecting him to see the next season, dying finally at his home, the Hermitage, outside Nashville, of heart failure and dropsy. He outlasted everyone's predictions. Of course he did. On the last night before he left, after the boxes had been packed and the arrangements made and the endless documentation of transition had been completed, you were in the corridor outside his rooms finishing some last task when the door opened and he came out. Not going anywhere, apparently, just standing in the corridor. He looked at you. "You're staying on?" he asked. Van Buren, the incoming president, had asked to retain several members of the household staff. "Yes, sir." He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. The corridor was lit with candles, and the light was warm and strange on his face, on the lines of it, on the white hair. "Treat him well," Jackson said. He meant Van Buren. "Yes, sir." "He's not what this house has had before. Needs time to know it." "Yes, sir." He looked down the corridor toward the window at the end. Outside, Washington was cold and dark, a few lights visible in the distance. "I came here with nothing," he said. "Same as you did, I'd guess. You'd not told him much about your arrival. You'd not needed to. He had known since that first morning with the linens. Same as you did, you said." Something like satisfaction crossed his face, just briefly. "Not a bad outcome, then," he said. He went back into his rooms. You heard the door close. You stood in the corridor for a while longer. In the morning he would be gone. The long adventure of the Jackson White House would be over. You would serve another president, and another after that, and the house would continue, and the city would continue, and the river would continue, and the things that had happened here would layer themselves into the accumulated history of the place. But right now, in this corridor, in this light, the night was very quiet. The White House settles at night. You've heard it for years now. The sounds the building makes when the fires die down, and the staff retires, and the business of the day winds itself to stillness. It is not silence exactly. It is never silence in a building this old, in a city this busy. There are always the sounds from the street, watchmen calling the hours, horses on cobblestones somewhere. Occasionally the far-off sound of a tavern making the sounds that taverns make, laughter or shouting, or the specific combination of both that means someone has made a decision they will reconsider by morning. But inside, the building has its own sounds, the wood settling as the temperature drops, the tick of metal contracting in the fireplaces, the creak of a floorboard somewhere in the house that has been creaking since before you arrived, and as will be creaking long after you're gone. You're in your room. A small room at the back of the house, not the attic anymore because you have moved rooms over the years, accumulated small improvements in your circumstances the way small improvements accumulate when you are present and reliable and known to the place, but still modest. Still a cot, a table, a chair, a window that looks at a wall. The cot is good, better than it was. You lie on it and stare at the ceiling, and the events of 8 years organize themselves in your memory, the way the days organize themselves when you are tired enough for sleep to be close but not yet close enough. The cheese, the smell of it, the sound of the wooden frame settling under it, the look on Margaret's face, the 2 days of clean-up, the inauguration, 20,000 people, the man in muddy boots on the settee, cracking it, shrugging, moving on, the punch bowls being carried outside, the crowd following like a river finding its way around an obstacle, the bullet, a sharp sound through a closed door, the physician carrying something wrapped in cloth, the corridor, Jackson standing there looking toward the window. Not a bad outcome then. The spittoons, always the spittoons, the particular weight of a full one, carried at arm's length first thing in the morning, the mornings when the handkerchief on the table had red on it, and you would see it and fold it away quickly and replace it with clean linen and not think about what it meant because thinking about it was not useful, and the work was what was useful. The long days of heat in July, the long nights of cold in January, the mud of spring and the leaves of autumn and the river always there, always the river, visible from the upper windows if you stood at the right angle, the city changing around the building, more streets paved, more buildings appearing where the weeds used to be, the long, slow process of Washington becoming something closer to what L'Enfant had drawn, at a pace that would not complete itself in your lifetime or anyone's currently alive lifetime, but continuing, always continuing. You close your eyes. The sounds of the building settle into each other, the settling of the wood, the far-off watchman, the particular quiet of a large old house very late at night. This is the thing about hygiene in history that most of us do not actually sit with. It is not that people were ignorant or careless or fundamentally different from us. They were doing what made sense with what they had. They were operating within the knowledge and the infrastructure and the social structures of their moment, just as you are operating within yours. They could not know what had not been discovered yet. They could not build what had not been invented yet. The doctors giving calomel believed it was helping. The physicians doing bloodletting were operating on the accumulated wisdom of 2,000 years of medical tradition. The spittoons were a reasonable accommodation for a practice that everyone around them shared. The water, carried in buckets, was the water system that existed. In the middle of all of it, in the middle of the calomel and the bloodletting and the bullets and the spittoons and the privies and the 40,000 people and the inadequate well and the mud and the heat and the cold and the 1,400 pounds of cheese in the entrance hall, people were trying to govern, trying to survive, trying to build something that might last. A man with a bullet near his heart, a city built on a swamp, a republic that was young enough that people who had been born before it still walked the streets. And yet here you are, some centuries later, listening to a story about it. So something lasted. Some things always last. The sounds fade a little more. The watchman is farther away now, or you're drifting far enough towards sleep that you're not quite hearing him anymore. The building sounds become something like music, if music is a generous word for it. A rhythm without melody. The rhythm of a very old building doing what old buildings do. You think about the people who slept in this building before you came, and who will sleep here after you're gone, which is a thought that in the light of day would seem strange, but at this hour, in this state between waking and sleeping, feels natural and correct. Buildings accumulate time the way people accumulate experience. The wood in the walls has been here since 1817, and it will be here long after you go back to Tennessee, and what it has absorbed of the years is in it somewhere, not in any way you could point to, but in there. The room is very quiet. Your body is making the small adjustments it makes towards sleep, the muscles releasing their held positions, the breath slowing without any effort on your part, the thoughts becoming less linear, less insistent, softer at their edges. You are warm enough, you are fed enough, you are safe enough. In a city that has asked a great deal of everyone who has come to it, from the builders who laid the sandstone and the workers who hauled the water and the soldiers who watched the British burn it down and rebuild it, you have given what was asked of you, and you have received something back. Not in money or title, but in the particular kind of knowledge that only comes from being close to something real. You have seen what it looks like to run a nation from the inside. You have seen what a president looks like before his hair is arranged. You have held a lot of buckets. These things are not nothing. They are in fact quite a lot. Centuries will pass. The building on the hill above the Potomac will change and change again. The sandstone walls will be repainted and replastered, and the interior will be renovated so many times that almost nothing of what you knew will be physically present in what remains. The well will be replaced with plumbing. The privy structures will be replaced with things that the residents of 1829 would find difficult to believe, and the residents of the future find entirely ordinary. The calomel will eventually be understood for what it was. The bloodletting will be abandoned, not without resistance, as one generation of physicians insists it works, and the next generation discovers that it does not. The bullet in Jackson's chest will be found after his death, and will be catalogued and discussed and included in the historical record of a life that was full of things to include. But the house will be there, and people will still live in it, will still wake before dawn, and work the long days and carry things from one end of a building to another, and look out the windows at the city and wonder what comes next. Some things do not change, the work does not change, the weight of it, and the strange satisfaction of it, and the way that being present for something matters even when you are not the most important person in the room. The human need for rest at the end of a long day, that does not change either. And the need for all of this, for the story of how it actually was, not the clean version, but the real one, with the spittoons and the bullets and the bucket and the cheese, that need does not change. You have earned your rest. The building settles around you. The city hums its late-night hum. The river moves in the dark, the same river that was there when you arrived, and will be there long after you leave. Let sleep take you the way it took 1,000 young men in 1,000 rooms in this city, one by one, night by night, across all the long years. Let the sounds quiet. Let the thoughts slow and soften and finally stop. Let this be enough. Let it come. Good night.